Discover Geography, Lesson 5-5, Theories of Justice. When we discuss environmental justice and injustice, it's important for us to use consistent theories as to what makes something just or unjust. This allows us to analyze situations in which we have questions, in which we're not sure whether something is just or unjust. And it allows us to engage in debate with other people. If we can explain why we view something as just or unjust, we can potentially offer arguments and evidence in support of that and potentially convince other people who disagree with us to change their opinion and agree. Or it would allow us to see the flaws in our own view and to change our views to match those of someone else that we're debating with. So it's important to be able to clearly analyze what is it that makes something just or unjust, and to apply these general theories to specific situations in which there is some claim of an injustice existing. When analyzing alleged environmental injustices, we can draw a distinction between substantive justice and procedural justice. Substantive justice refers to the outcome or the decision at issue. So, for example, the decision to locate a polluting facility in a particular neighborhood and the outcome of pollution being emitted from that facility into the neighborhood. If we believe that that is a good outcome or a correct decision to have been made, then we believe we have substantive justice. If we think that was the wrong decision, if we think in this example that factory shouldn't be there, that it's unjust for it to be in that particular location, then that's a claim of substantive injustice. Procedural justice has to do with the way that decision was made. Who got to decide that that factory would be located in that location? Are they the right person or group to have made that decision? Did they make that decision following the correct procedures? So, for example, someone might argue that placing that factory in that neighborhood is unjust because it was made by the county zoning board. And really, placing a facility like that in a neighborhood should require a vote of all the neighbors to approve it. If that's the argument, that's an argument about procedural injustice, that the decision was made in the wrong way. You often see claims of substantive and procedural injustice going together, with the implication that a bad decision got made because it was made in the wrong way, and that if we used the right procedure for making the decision, we would have gotten the just outcome. But they can come apart. You can have a situation that's procedurally just but substantively unjust, or vice versa. Take the election of Barack Obama, for example. From a Republican point of view, Obama's election was substantively unjust. The wrong person got to be president. From a Republican point of view, it would have been better to have John McCain or Mitt Romney as president rather than Barack Obama. Obama is bad for the country. He's leading us in the wrong direction, causing various other injustices through his policies, etc. So it's a substantively unjust situation that Obama got elected from a Republican point of view. On the other hand, most Republicans would tend to agree that Obama's election was procedurally just, that elections are the correct way to choose a president as opposed to all the other ways that we might choose a leader, and that these particular elections in 2008 and 2012 were done in a basically fair way, and that they basically represent the will of the American people, that most people wanted Obama to be president, even though from the Republican point of view, they were making the wrong choice. On the other hand, if Obama were to have seized power in a military coup, you might see Democrats saying that that was a substantively just outcome. We got the right person as our leader. Obama's going to be good for the country, but procedurally unjust, that a military coup is not the right way to choose the leader of a country, that we should have had an election. So when you're making a claim about justice, we want to be clear on whether you're claiming a substantive injustice, a procedural injustice, or some combination of them. Now, what is it that makes something substantively or procedurally just? Well, to determine that, we turn to various principles of justice. These are broad-scale explanations of what makes something just or unjust. And I'm going to use as a running example this woman who was a speaker at a climate change rally, and I'm just going to put words in her mouth to illustrate some of the common principles of justice that you may hear. For the purposes of this lesson, what's important is understanding what these different principles are, knowing what it would mean for something to be just or unjust according to this principle. It's up to you to decide which principles you think are most important and in what situations you think one principle rather than another might apply. The first principle we'll look at is the principle of happiness. The principle of happiness says that an outcome is just if it produces the most happiness for the most people and the least suffering for the fewest people. And a situation is unjust if it produces less happiness and more suffering than was otherwise possible with another choice that could have been made. So for example, this woman might say, climate change will cause more suffering for more people than the alternative of adopting some policy to combat climate change. So in this case, the claim of injustice is based on the amount of suffering that will happen if we make a certain choice, such as the choice not to do anything to stop climate change. The principle of rights is a principle that says there are certain rights that people have that cannot be violated without those people's consent, no matter how much good that may do. No matter how much suffering that might alleviate for how many people, no matter how much happiness that might create for how many people, if someone has a right to something, you can't violate that right without their consent. So in this case, she might say, we do not consent to the impacts of climate change. Climate change is going to do various things to us, and that will violate our rights. We don't consent to having sea levels rise and overtake our properties along the shore, for example. So you can already see that different principles might lead to different conclusions. Something that violates some people's rights but creates a huge amount of happiness might be just if you're relying purely on the principle of happiness, but it would be unjust if you're relying purely on the principle of rights. So there's a lot more work to be done to determine which principles apply in which situations. Another common principle is the principle of equality. The principle of equality says that all people and all groups should be treated the same unless you have a good reason not to. So for example, this woman might argue that climate change is unjust because it hurts some people more than others. So people in the developing world are going to suffer more than people in the developed world. And that's unjust because one group is being treated unequally as compared to another. We also have the principle of duty. The principle of duty is based on the idea that certain types of social relationships bring with them special duties that one person has to another. So for example, this woman might argue that as a mother, she has a special duty to protect her children from climate change. So the parent-child relationship is one that we recognize as creating special duties for the parent. The parent has special things that they're obligated to do for their own children that they're not obligated to do for any old child that they may encounter. They have a special relationship with their child that carries with it special duties. We might also see these kind of duties between an employer and an employee, or between a community leader and their supporters. If we think that a particular social relationship that two people are involved in imposes special duties on one of them, then it's unjust for them to fail at carrying out that duty. And finally, we have the principle of desert. Desert is the noun form of the word deserve. So the principle of desert basically says people should get what they deserve. People who have done bad things should have bad things happen to them as a punishment. People who have been good should have good things happen to them as a reward. So everyone gets what they deserve based on their past good or bad behavior. So in the context of climate change, this woman might argue, we haven't done anything wrong, we haven't done anything bad, so we don't deserve to have the bad effects of climate change hit us. All 5 of these principles can be applied to a variety of different situations, and different principles might produce different outcomes. But even if 2 people are arguing based on different principles, if they can understand which principles each side is coming from, they can at least understand the nature of their disagreement. they can understand that this is a disagreement about principles, or is this a disagreement about the facts? If we're both arguing from the principle of happiness, but one of us thinks a certain result will create more happiness and the other person thinks that it won't. Once we understand the nature of that disagreement, then we can start to work towards solving it, towards figuring out how one person might convince the other person that their perspective is correct and that the other person ought to change their mind. Another issue to consider when analyzing whether something is just or unjust is whether intent matters. Does it matter whether the seemingly unjust situation was created intentionally, or is it still unjust even if it was created unintentionally? So for example, if there is inequality in access to good parts of the environment, if there is residential segregation that forces one group of people into bad polluted environments and allows the other group of people to access good clean environments, does it matter if that residential segregation was something that was done intentionally through redlining and housing discrimination, for example, where somebody said, I want to make sure that this group suffers more, that this group gets stuck with the worst environment? Or is it still unjust if it just happened without anybody intending it to be that way? In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on this issue and said that for purposes of bringing a lawsuit under U.S. law at this time, you do in fact have to prove intent. So as of the Supreme Court decision in Alexander v. Sandoval in 2001, in order to claim to be the victim of an environmental injustice, you have to show that the discrimination that you suffered was intentional, that somebody intended to treat one group worse than another. That doesn't mean that intent doesn't matter. It simply means that under U.S. law, you can't sue for an unintentional injustice. The final thing that we want to think about is considerability. Considerability refers to the question of what kinds of entities can be potential victims of injustices. Who can be suffering from an injustice and can complain about it? Most of our discussion thus far has dealt with human victims, and pretty much everyone can agree that any human can be a victim of injustice, that you can treat a person unjustly. If that is the only set of beings that you think can be victims of injustice, that would be referred to as a philosophy of anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism means only humans can be victims of injustices. Any bad thing you might do to a non-human, anything that you might do to a forest, for example, is only unjust insofar as it causes suffering to humans or violates a human's right. For example, you cut down someone else's forest that's their property, or that gives people something that they don't deserve, depending on what theory of justice that you are relying on. Anthropocentrism is the idea that only humans can ultimately be the real victims of an injustice. However, some people would argue that we ought to expand the scope of considerability, that there are other beings that can also be victims of injustices. So one such theory, something that we could call sentient centrism. Sentient centrism says that any sentient being can be the victim of injustice. Sentience means the ability to feel pleasure and pain. So any being that can dislike what's happening to it or like some other thing that might happen to it, any being that can be unhappy about what's happening to it, can potentially be the victim of an injustice. So if we adopt the philosophy of sentient centrism, then most animals, certainly mammals and birds, could be potential victims of injustices. So if I do something to hurt a dog, well, that dog obviously is not going to like that. And so under a sentient-centric philosophy, we could say that I've committed an injustice against that dog. We could then expand even farther and say that even living things that aren't capable of feeling pleasure and pain, that aren't capable of having preferences about what they want to happen to them, can still be the victims of injustice. We would call this philosophy biocentrism. So under a biocentric philosophy, any living being can be the victim of injustice. So you could commit an injustice against a tree under a biocentric viewpoint. Some people will go yet even farther than that. And they would say not only individual living things of whatever type could be victims of injustice, but ecosystems could be victims of injustice. That you can commit an injustice against a mountain or against a forest, not just against the individual trees in this forest, not just against the people that might live there and depend on this forest, but the forest itself can be the victim of injustice. This philosophy would be known as ecocentrism. Now you'll notice that as we've expanded this circle on the slide, the humans have gotten more and more obscured. The more we expand the circle to encompass things in addition to humans, the less important humans become. For some people, this is a good thing. This is exactly what we want. We want to get rid of the idea that humans are super uniquely special in the world and deserve more consideration than any other being in this world. On the other hand, other people find that to be a big concern. If you are a hardcore ecocentrist, you may find that it seems just to do something that would greatly hurt humanity, that may even require something like drastic population reduction for humanity in order to be just towards non-human ecosystems. And so for this reason, expanding the circle wider is not universally agreed on as a good thing. And in fact, many of the instances in which the environmental justice movement makes complaints against the mainstream environmental movement are based on the idea that the mainstream environmental movement is valuing non-human things too much and therefore giving short shrift to the concerns and the injustices suffered by humans. So again, with considerability, it's important to know where you stand with respect to considerability. It's important to know which kind of things you're going to believe really can be the victims of injustice. But there's not one correct answer to this question that I can give in the space of a short lesson like this. What's important is to understand the concepts of anthropocentrism, sentient centrism, biocentrism, ecocentrism, in order to make your own choice about which of these philosophies you subscribe to, and to understand what other people are talking about when they employ one of these philosophies.